The second nightly tale, Brookestone, the Vampire. Chapter 1. The strong and musky aroma of Walsh stew still permeated the air as the half-empty pot bubbled on the crackling fire in Darmir's fireplace. He told us several days earlier that, should we be interested in meeting earlier than usual to hear his tales, we could join him for an evening meal. All agreed that his invitation was too good to pass by, for he was not just known for his stories and wisdom, but also for his cooking. Darmir, as usual, drew a tankard of dark ale and set it on the table beside him. As always, my friends and I sat about the fur-covered floor, all except Hector. His absence was due to an incident 2 days earlier in which his horse had kicked him. While not seriously injured, he had suffered several cracked ribs, and although a healer was present, his father would not let her heal him with magic. A lesson with pain is a lesson well learned, his father said. I thought that a bit harsh, but then what Hector did to his steed deserved no less than he got. Besides, none of us would miss him. Christine was at my side, as she had been since our last meeting. I grew quite accustomed to her bright smile and warm touch on my arm. I was rapidly finding this time of year, with its cool nights, was highly conducive to romance. To think I once thought winter the most unpleasant season of the year. 3 more joined us this night. The twins, Jan and Jania, had been here before, but they missed the 2 previous stories due to a family trip to some lands 2 fortnights' ride west. Both had fair hair that shone with the same light gold of straw. Beneath their brows were eyes of ice blue sapphire. Their lightly freckled faces and bright white smiles could melt the angriest soul. Though too young to catch my interest, it was always my impression that when Jania reached womanhood, her looks would bring many knights to their knees for her favor. Christine felt the same would be true for Jan and the maidens. Christine and I told the twins, as best we could, the story of Aleph and Marist battling Vorta the dragon. Jan was still boyish enough at heart to imagine himself as the hero of that adventure, and told us how he would have done it differently. To my amusement, he said one of the things he would change would be to avoid getting romantically involved with the elf. With a smirk, I said his tune would change in time. Jania had the same reaction to the story as Christine, giving the 2 of them a fit of giggles and smiles. Tales of knights rescuing their ladies were a strong influence on the romantic side of women. The 3rd person joining us this night was new to all of us. Kalar was the son of a new lord who moved next to my father's lands. His father soon learned of our story sessions from mine, and out of wisdom and concern for his son's mood, he decided that Kalar should join us, so he could fit better in and make new friends. He was an odd one. Though tall, strong, and well-educated in the knightly ways, few liked him. He seldom smiled or laughed, continually wearing a grim expression that appeared darker than it was due to his raven hair and dark eyes. Christine and I were the only ones to make overtures of friendship to him. We were half-heartedly accepted as acquaintances, not friends. I felt he must not have known many people of his own age. He had all the right manners, but he lacked the social graces for dealing with his peers. For myself, it seemed he had a greatness in him that was just beginning to show. Upon introducing him to Darmir and seeing the man's reaction, I knew he felt the same. After introductions and salutations, we waited patiently for Darmir to begin. He never revealed what the subject would be in advance. Christine hinted she wanted to hear more about Aleph and Marist. With her soft eyes and seductive smile, I knew she could convince Darmir to tell more of the 2 adventurers. If he were able to resist her magical charms of womanhood, he was a stronger man than I could ever or want to be. He smiled when Christine voiced her request. I know full well of the adventures of the one-time knight and elfin ranger. He winked at me for some reason. I would be glad to tell you more. Jan raised a hand. Sir, he asked respectfully, I've heard of the last tale of the two heroes you told, and unless these two, he nodded toward Christine and me, have left something out, there was a mystery over how the elf killed a dragon with her lightning spell. Could you explain? Darmer smiled. Now that was a secret she kept some time before telling. The truth is, unknown to Aleph, she found among the treasures of Vortah's lair a long, thin wire of pure gold. Why or for what the wire was made was no matter to her. She quickly tied the end to her last Shurkite arrow and shot it into the dragon's back. Once it was firmly embedded, she grabbed hold and cast her spell. The lightning bolt traveled down the wire and into Vortah's body, killing him. Jenya hit her brother's arm. See? I told you she didn't grab his tail. Could have, he shrugged. Darmer smiled at their banner, then leaned back in his oak rocker, the creek signaling us to be still. This adventure begins after the last, he said, seeing the twins quiet down. Although this adventure would stem from part of the former knight's past, it would have dread results later. I glanced at Christine when Darmer spoke that last, for his voice suddenly became sad, underscoring the truth of his words. Chapter 2. At the start of Vortah's reign of terror, many knights sought to destroy him until the fall of Duke Herod's castle. When word spread of the crumbled walls and ruined keep, none ventured forth to meet the monster. Neither were the various lords anxious to send forth their knights, for fear of having no protection if the dragon came upon them next. Nonetheless, as crops and livestock vanished in the dragon flame, it became obvious that something had to be done, or people would starve. The current ruler of Norval, Lord Edbert Reston, called a great meeting in the center of Boland, the capital city, for all those whom his lords considered their best knights. He sent announcements throughout the land for the greatest warriors and adventurers to wet their blades in dragon blood, and come to make counsel to rid the land of the scourge, not knowing the deed had already been done. On that day, one could hear the clanking of many armored knights before reaching the town's outer limits. Once into the packed center, there were adventurers beyond count. Knights, cavaliers, paladins, wizards, druids, rangers, and many others, human or otherwise. All gathered as if to make an army of war. It was an awe-inspiring sight that all remembered for many years. With a population close to 10,000, the city overflowed with the armored visitors bearing multitudes of banners, along with mercenaries for whom the only colors that mattered were gold and silver. On the cobblestone streets towered a few of the fierce Degan, brutish humanoids, 8 feet tall, with the body and, as many soon discovered, the manners of a bear. There was a sparse pack of Canis, the wolf-like people of the northern regions, who stood away from the crowds but remained close enough to see and hear what was said in the square. Even more rare were 3 gaily dressed Felis, their clothes making them stand out as much as their cat-like features. Saurian warriors, dwarves, humans, and even a few half-giants crowded together in the bright midday sun to hear what Lord Reston said. Tower bells rang out, signaling all that it was time to attend to the man who called them together. In the raised town center stood Lord Reston. Once a knight in his own right, he was an overweight, fancy-dressed man, though he was no less honorable than he had been. The fact that he was the duly elected ruler of Norval, and remained so for 18 years, spoke of the respect and honor his subjects felt for him. He stroked his red beard and scanned the crowd, noting a few familiar faces. With a loud, commanding voice, he described the horror that befell the land. Heads nodded as he told of burned crops, houses, and murdered people. He ended his list of destruction by admitting that his list was probably short by several hundred deaths and disasters. He offered to increase the reward from 50,000 rims to the staggering amount of 200,000 to whoever brought him the red dragon's head. People muttered in awe at such an amount. It was enough to become a ruler of a large castle, an even greater amount of land. Murmurs rose throughout the gathering, but no one stepped up to make a claim or to accept a challenge, because all knew death would be their reward. Lord Reston frowned in disappointment, scanning the faces before him. Many he did not know, but there were others he did. Despite their frequent boasts, they lowered their heads in shame, unable to meet his gaze. In all the land, no one had the courage to earn the reward. Then he noticed two figures riding slowly toward him on horseback. The crowd grudgingly gave way before them. One was a tall, bearded man dressed in flame-red shirt under a black leather vest and matching black pants. In front of him, draped over his saddle horn, was a large object bundled in burlap. The man seemed vaguely familiar, but Reston could not place him. Though the man carried no banner, the way he rode told Reston he had the bearing of a knight. The second rider was an elfin female in a somewhat revealing white linen bodice with light brown leather vest. Long tan legs extended from under a short leather skirt to end with calf-length laced boots. Her manner and looks drew lingering stares from many of the men. Most of the crowd had never seen an elf and had only heard rumors of them. Elves rarely reached human-controlled cities anymore, not since the Great Elfin War many generations earlier. Dislike for that race was deep-seated for many generations. Indeed, some of the longer-lived races had members who had been alive during that war. Nonetheless, when an elfin woman was seen, there were few men that did not stop, stare, and fantasize. Lord Reston watched as a burly man stepped forward to stand before the elf's mount. He said something Reston could not hear. The elf turned and made two retorts. One was verbal, the second was a kick in the man's face. He fell backward to the cobblestone street as his companions laughed and jeered. Lord Reston also noted her companion's partly drawn sword before it slid back into the scabbard. Continuing forward, the man silently rode up to Reston and flipped back the burlap, letting the contents roll free. Lord Reston stepped back, wondering what to expect. Shock and surprise played across his face as Vorta's severed head rolled to his feet and stopped, one great yellow eye staring up in death. The crowd gasped with him. Those closest told others of the grisly prize displayed on the stones. Just as silently, the two turned their mounts and rode away without saying a word. "Wait!" Reston called. All eyes followed the pair in wonder. The crowd parted to let them by. "Who are you?" Reston asked. "What about the reward? Don't you wish to claim it?" The two stopped their horses. Aleph turned and looked back. Speaking in a deep, stern voice, "We are two who had the spine to fight for those who could not." He glanced at the gathered crowd. "Or those who would not. As for the reward, give it to those who deserve it, the families and survivors of Vorta. They lost the most, so they need the most." The two nudged their mounts through the silent crowd. Such was the beginning of a legend. "Admirable," Kalar said, the first word he'd spoke without being addressed. Darmir smiled slightly and nodded. I thought so myself." 'Twas true that Aleph and Marist had no need of the reward. Beyond Aleph's personal wealth, Vorta's lair held enough treasure for 1,000 lifetimes. They took some of it and gave it to anyone who suffered under the dragon, then gave more to several monasteries to be distributed as best they could. Knowing they would never be able to spread the wealth to all who deserved it, they left the rest in the cave. Though they had no need for riches, the pair still yearned for adventure. 3 weeks after their trip to Bolin, the two warriors gazed upon the dark woods of the great swamp. Dusk made it too risky to travel in safety, so they made camp. Soon a crackle of burning wood broke the silent darkness, as firelight sent out warm hues of yellow through gloomy forest, and smoked weed through the darkened wood like an apparition. Not only would the flames keep away most of the swamp-dwelling animals, they also provided welcome warmth against the cool damp. Aleph and Marist became very close after the battle with Vorta, and their two bedrolls became one. Marist was the one who began that sleeping arrangement, though both enjoyed it. She amused herself with the thought of Aleph being too chivalrous and a gentleman to initiate such action, no matter how likely it would be to be accepted. The elf stopped piling firewood for a moment and glanced at Aleph's shadowy form as he gathered wood from the dark marsh. She studied the man's tall form and smiled in reflection. She had rarely been one to seek a man's company, and certainly for no longer than 1 or 2 nights. Even then, it was just for physical pleasure. An emotional relationship was not anything she cared for, because she enjoyed her freedom too much. But when she wrapped herself in the warmth of his muscled arms and their surprisingly gentle hold, she never regretted it. She laughed softly to herself, remembering their first night together and Aleph's uncertain, almost timid attitude, as if he feared she was so fragile he might break her with a hug. Once he realized she was not fragile, and most certainly was not being forced to do anything against her own desire, they shared their passion many times until they fell sound asleep in each other's arms. Had she known true love was like that, she would have tried it long before now. Though they faced death together more than once, Aleph was still a mystery. He had not said much about his past life, despite her questions, making it clear, by his silence, that he did not want to talk about it. She imagined it stemmed from the loss of his family to Vorta, though he mentioned that only once. Despite his silence, though, his actions and mannerisms revealed some information. She guessed that, at one time, he had been a knight cavalier, perhaps a paladin, though she was doubtful about the latter. His mannerisms were far too civilized for him to be an errant Badlands warrior, barbarian, or rogue mercenary. He definitely had training in the use of weapons, not just some self-taught style. She met far too many such men in the past that pretended, badly, to be something they weren't or could ever hope to be, no matter how many years they tried. Then again, he was pretending too, though Aleph pretended to be less than he really was. The reason for him becoming the man she knew was not yet clear, other than Aleth's brief explanation about hunting Vorta. With the last log set in the pile, Marist decided to make a determined effort to learn his secrets before long. Within the hour, a roasted wild gunt bird was staked near the fire to cook slowly, sending its savory odors to tease their senses with the promised flavor of cooked meat. They enjoyed the meat, and their mutual company until the veil of sleep came over them. A few hours later, Marist awoke with a start. Dark brown eyes stared into the clear night sky for storm clouds. There were none, or any other indication of what woke her, though she felt a sudden chill. Something was wrong, but she did not know what. The elf slowly looked at Aleph's face, hoping not to wake him. He slept soundly in her arms, his breathing deep and easy. Still, the chill remained. She scanned the camp and swamp beyond, trying not to wake him. No sounds echoed through the forest to indicate a dangerous animal, or other creature that might creep around in the darkness. Nothing showed beyond the glow of their campfire, no reflecting spots of light from watching eyes. Finally, as she stared into the gloom, she caught the faintest of light in the dark marsh. She nudged Aleph awake, keeping one hand over his mouth to quiet him. "Something's out there," she whispered as he blinked. "Where?" he asked quietly, his hand moving at the sword by his side. She moved her hand slowly over his chest, as if she were just tossing in her sleep. "There, just beyond that group of cypress trees." Aleph turned his head slowly, looked past the dark cypress trees ringing the camp. Squinting, he saw 3, no 4, glowing spots of light, each moving slowly, bobbing erratically through the dark woods. They watched the floating objects for a moment. "Are they lanterns?" he asked, watching the glowing lights float a few feet above the ground. Marist squinted and shook her head. Even with her excellent night vision, she saw nothing but the glow. "I don't see any forms beside the lights. If those are lanterns, we should see something of those who carry them." He strained his eyes at the floating yellow lights. I don't see anyone either, but it looks like they're coming closer. Will-o-wisps? Marist asked in concern. Alf glanced at her and frowned. I've heard stories of those creatures, he said quietly, watching the lights drift like butterflies above a meadow, but I have never seen one. She shook her head. Nor I. Some say they steal travelers' souls. I don't know the truth of that. It's best we lay still and hopefully move on. The 4 balls of soft yellow light, each the size of a man's head, floated silently and slowly among the trees, moving toward their tied mounts. The horses snorted nervously at the approaching lights. One suddenly shot forward and dived through Marist's horse. It appeared unharmed, but the will-o-wisp that went through it was larger and brighter. It flew upward to join its brethren, whereupon all 4 dived into the horse. The horse gave a short, tortured whine and dropped to the ground as if dead weight, all of its life energy having been drained. The 4, brighter than before, moved towards Alf's horse. That's it, Mary said angrily, rising to her knees. Time to fry a whisper. Before Alice could protest, her complicated hand movements created 2 flaming shapes near the floating lights. The magical flames became 2 large hawks, their bodies composed of orange and yellow flames instead of feathers. Her hand movements finished, Maris sent the firehawks into battle. The 2 blazing hawks dived toward the largest of the floating lights, trailing yellow fire like a long tail. As soon as the flaming talons touched the sphere, however, the firehawks faded into nothingness, their only apparent effect being that the will-o-wisp was larger from the absorbed magic. The creature drifted toward the warriors, as if the firehawks alerted it to their presence. The other will-o-wisps followed, ignoring the horse and focusing on what would provide more energy and food. Maris said, perhaps that wasn't the best idea. Most likely. Alf drew his new blade, Windgazer. It was not quite the 3-foot length of his original broadsword, but it was far better workmanship. The hilt and counterweight at the end of the pommel shone with the gleam of polished gold, while the blade was mirrored silver. Since his original sword had been melted by dragon fire, he'd hoped to find a replacement in the cavern before leaving. In examining the treasures and various collections in Vorta's cave, he found Windgazer lying among several large chests of gold and silver coinage bearing visages from a realm he did not recognize. Maris detected magic about the blade, but it was Alf who found the gold lettering on a nearby scabbard, which detailed some of the blade's qualities. Although 2 of the golden runes had been removed by exposure to dragon fire, 2 others were still visible. The first one was the word Alf spoke aloud, pointing the double-edged shaft of polished metal toward the floating spheres of light, aiming down the blood groove like an archer sighting down an arrow. A powerful blast of wind shot from the sword. The gust uprooted cypress trees larger than a man, sending them flying through the night air. A path 12 feet wide by 40 feet long was laid bare of trees and shrubs, as if a giant hand reached out to scoop it all away. When the wind subsided, the floating lights were still where they had been. The magic wind had not bothered them in the least. The 4 glowing balls moved toward the 2 warriors, causing Maris to look at Alf. Any ideals? You're the elf with the magic, he gave her a half-hearted smile, and then recalled what he'd seen the will-o-wisps do. Can you reverse the magic of your healing spell? She shifted her weight and considered that. Finally she nodded yes. I can reverse the flow of healing energy from another into me. Why? He stared at the approaching lights, his brow furrowed in thought. Just a thought. Attack one of them with a reversed healing spell. She hesitated, then said, I'll have to touch one. It looks like you'll have that chance whether you want to or not, lass. She nodded. Wish me luck, handsome. She gave him a light kiss. I'll be right behind you. No. She placed her hand on his chest. If this doesn't work, at least it'll buy you some time to get out of here. If it doesn't work, I can at least try to protect you from them with Windgazer's shield spell. He looked deep into her brown eyes. "I'll not let you face them alone." She smiled lovingly into his dark eyes, wishing she could melt in him, so much did she love him, and want to be that close. "You're my life, Aleph. As long as you live, so shall I." She smiled. "Besides, I don't want to trip over that slow old body of yours if I have to run." She jumped to her feet before he could stop her and sprinted into the dark marsh. Aleph almost ran after her, but he stopped with a grim smile. The one thing that infuriated him about her was that he wanted to defend her with his life, but he gave in, because he knew she was right and he was wrong. Actually, it was not the fact that she was right that annoyed him. It was having her know that she was right, and also knowing that he knew it too, but would never admit to it. He sighed in frustration before crouching behind a small bush, ready to spring forward to her aid if she needed it. Darmir stopped and gazed toward Kalar. "Well, young knight-to-be, what do you think the course of action the two are taking?" Kalar's usually grim face frowned more than normal at the question. "Although I don't know the extent of the elf's magic, Darmir, it is my opinion that if it is strong enough, she should go into battle alone. That frees her from having to protect a defenseless ally and concentrate on the battle at hand." Darmir's expression betrayed no thought or emotion. What of Aleph's attempt to jump to the rescue instead of flee? To die needlessly is a waste. "Is it?" he asked grimly. "Yes. As long as one survives, there is still a chance of challenging your foes later when you have the strength to defeat them." "How cold," Christine said. Darmir raised his hand. "Not at all, lass. It's the logic of a military mind speaking. Kalar is, indeed, correct if one were to think only about the final result of the war and not the battle itself. Hence the saying that one may win the battle, but not the war. Still, those who put their trust and loyalty of their followers before the rewards of victory would most likely say different." He gave me a questioning look. "What say you, young sire?" I frowned. Darmir was not one to usually pose such serious questions in the middle of a story. Still, I had not been visiting him for the past few years just to hear fanciful tales. He was considered the best strategist around, so I learned from his insight. "I agree with Kalar." I nodded toward Kalar. "In some instances, you send your best skilled warriors forward, and don't shirk if you're required to retreat if the battle goes against you. It might be a better strategy to cut your losses and leave the battle to raise a stronger army to defeat your enemy in the next engagement, since a great leader is more important than the troops during a battle. Such action shows your allies you have some concern for their well-being, but are not so reckless as to continually risk their lives in a useless fight." "Yet, if you were to do so, would it not also give your enemies time to gather and increase their strength too?" Jan asked. "True," I agreed. "In some instances you would retreat. In others you may face a case where you must risk all in order to win. You must weigh the outcome for each confrontation against the risk." I looked briefly into Christine's brown eyes. "Yet, in this instance, were I in Aleph's place, I would be willing to give my life to save the woman I loved." She smiled and drew closer, kissing my cheek before resting her head on my shoulder. Darmir neither frowned nor smiled at my response. Instead, he continued his story. Mara stopped when she was only a few feet away from the will-o'-wisps. Glancing back, she saw Aleph's concerned look. Casting thoughts of hesitation from her mind, she gave her full attention to the oncoming lights. The elfin ranger extended her hands just as one of the smaller spheres broke formation and sped toward her as it did when the horse was attacked. As soon as the floating light touched her outstretched hands, she reversed her healing spell. The will-o'-wisp immediately shrank in size and brightness and sped away as one would pull his hand back from a fire. It seemed Aleph was right. With a smile, Maris watched the dim sphere rejoin its companions and felt a rush of life energy enter her system. She could drain them, and hurt them. The dim will-o-wisp bobbed among its fellows for several moments, as if communicating with them. The largest moved toward the elf. She raised both hands, ready to counter any charge, but instead it circled her and moved toward Aleph. She turned slightly to keep it in view without losing sight of the three still in front of her, though that became increasingly difficult as the large one gained distance. The three small ones floated about, as if waiting for orders from the large one. "Don't worry about me," Aleph shouted, his sword raised. "Go on the offensive." She hesitated, then agreed, striding forward with her hands outstretched, ready to cast her reverse healing spell again. The three will-o-wisps floated backwards, away from her, drawing her farther from Aleph. "Behind you!" She spun, her hands out, just as the large will-o-wisp engulfed her hands. She cast her spell, which was more powerful than before due to the increased energy she had absorbed. The will-o-wisp dimmed and vanished into nothingness, like a candle that had been snuffed. Flushed with a sudden surge of energy, she turned back to ward off any attack from the three remaining will-o-wisps. To her surprise, they were moving rapidly toward the swamp from whence they came. She studied the ground beside her where the dead will-o-wisp should have been, but saw nothing but swamp grass and moist earth. Looking up, she saw Aleph walking toward her. "How did you know," she asked, "that my reverse healing spell would harm them?" He looked at her, making sure she was all right. Confident that she was unharmed, he shrugged. "They absorbed energy from life and your magic. I thought if you could reverse your healing spell and to take energy and not give it, they could be hurt." He looked at the spot of ground she just examined. "Interesting that there's no physical body." "Yes," she rubbed her hands together as if warming him. "It was like touching cold fog." He smiled slightly. "I'll just have to remember what those hands are capable of." "You'd best do that," she had a devilish grin, adding, "with what you put into my hands." She leaped at him and wrapped her arms around him. "In fact, I'm so full of energy right now from absorbing that thing, I could use some relief, if you don't think I would wear you out too much." He smiled and prepared to reply, but her lips pressed against his. She pushed him off balance and they fell backward into each other's arms. A murmur from Kalar stopped Darmir's narration. "What was that, young sir?" he asked. Kalar smiled slightly. "I was thinking that Aleph was a good tactician. He knew what would happen if Maris pressed the attack." "Not at all, lad," Darmir shook his white-haired head. He was concerned that, if she turned to follow the will-o-wisp nearing him, the others would have attacked her from behind. He did not think the wisp would turn and attack as it did. That it did so showed an intelligence he did not believe it possessed. Kalar nodded slightly in understanding. "One must never underestimate the enemy." "Easily said in hindsight, Kalar," I replied. "Difficult to do at the time." Kalar and Darmir agreed, making them look at each other briefly. Darmir nodded to me again. "Quite right." He continued the tale.